Hi everyone. This is the presentation for Chapter 13 on sexuality, the biological basis of sexual behavior. I just want to go over some of the major concepts, some of the major findings throughout the chapter, kind of go through some of the content here with you. I will have this on the website, obviously, and on a discussion thread where you can post maybe questions or if there's something in the material, either in this presentation or in the chapter in the book itself that you have a question about, you can post that and I'll try to get to all of those. Or just comments in general. Um, you know, this, the chapter on, this is hormones. Let me pull this up here. By the way, when you go through your notes, you'll notice if you go into outline view like I have here, you can see a lot of detailed notes, by the way, just to let you know. And these are online, so you can see these. Hormones and sex. Um, the title here it's kind of an odd title. You might be, what are they talking about here? What's wrong with the mama wawa kind of thing? It's kind of odd. This just refers to the fact that the distinction between males and females, we're talking about humans in particular, between male and female, we're normally referred to as sexually dimorphic, meaning that males and females have different characteristics. And we're not the only species like that. But the distinction between maleness and femaleness is not completely black and white. That's all they're saying, that it's more of a continuum. All right, but some of that'll make more sense later. Um, so it's not as, and I'm not trying to say that certainly males and females are different, obviously, but it's not quite as clear cut in some cases, and that's what we'll get through in the chapter. But let's move on here. One of the things we'll go through, let me just get to go to view here. Let's just do, actually, we'll just do normal for a moment here. Kind of going through some of this. We're going to talk about the endocrine system, development. In particular, we'll talk about circuitry in the brain, talk about some interesting cases where you get what's called the intersex condition, and that's most of what will be in here. But yes, we'll mention some of the brain mechanisms that are involved with sexual behavior and stuff like that, gender identity, and so forth. All right, so with the endocrine system, um, you can see the endocrine glands, and this is one of the endocrine system, of course, deals with the hormones in the body, and hormones are chemicals that have long-lasting effects on the body, or at least longer-lasting effects. Some of which, by the way, can be neurotransmitters in the brain. They can be hormones in the body. But here you can see an overview of the glands. And there's the pineal, and the hypothalamus is shown here because the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that controls the endocrine system. The pituitary is the master gland. Then we have all these other glands that perform a variety of important functions. For the sexual chapter, of course, what's important: the testes for the male and the ovaries for the female. Um, I need to be aware, of course, of the sex chromosomes, X and Y. That's sort of interesting. We all know that gender is a lot of a lot of gender determination is through the chromosomes. So females have two X's, males have an X and a Y. We'll see though with the intersex condition that this alone does not necessarily determine sex for some people, a very small percentage of people. Okay, so some hormones, you can see we've got androgens, we have estrogens. One of the things you'll learn in the chapter is that we have both males and females have these. For example, we often think of androgens, which would be, let's say one of them be testosterone. We think of that as the male hormone, and estrogen's more the female hormone. Well, males and females have both of these. It's just different concentrations. All right, so be aware about the pituitary. It's the master gland. Let me go back to outline view again here, if this will work. Hello, there we go. That's the master gland. It controls the other glands. It's divided into some different parts, most notably a front and the back, basically anterior and and posterior. And the hypothalamus connects to it and basically controls it through what are called releasing factors. And the medical profession essentially views the whole hypothalamic pituitary interaction as working in a feedback mechanism. So if there's enough of a hormone detected, less will be produced, almost like the way a thermostat works. All right. So that's something to be aware of. And you can see here we've got female gonadotropic hormones, and that's, of course, the sexual hormones. They tend to be cyclic, okay, and that's true. So, for example, if you talk about the woman's so-called period, there's a cyclical variation in the hormones throughout the month. Males, I have read that there might be some cyclical aspect to male, but it's nothing compared to the female structure. So males are a bit more steady, but not always. I think that in general, of course, for the tests and stuff, I always go with what your book has for I use your book, but I have read that there might be some subtle variability, but nothing like the females. But here you can see some of the anatomy. Um, this is the side view of the brain and so forth, and here you can see there's the pituitary, anterior, posterior, and then the hypothalamus is connected to it essentially. All right. Once again, that pituitary controls the rest of the endocrine system. You can see it's involved with lots of stuff here. The posterior, you can see it's it controls a substance called vasopressin. And this deals with your thirst, reabsorption of water, keeping you hydrated. Oxytocin is another important hormone. This is an interesting one. They mention in here it's involved with the contraction of the uterus in the female, and it's involved with lactation here as well. A lot of research with humans on this. It's called the trust hormone. It's implicated in bonding, pair bonding, trust. It's also implicated. It tends to be elevated after a couple has had sexual intercourse or some sort of sexual activity. Oxytocin levels will go up, and so it's been implicated in a possible hormone to help people bond with each other. So that's still kind of speculative, but that's just thought I'd mention that. But here you can see a little bit more detail of the anatomy. Once again, you can just look at that in the book. Once again, they're showing you essentially the connection, basically the neurons of the hypothalamus are connected to the pituitary gland. So this is a neuroendocrine connection. Okay, and then you can see once again, kind of going through all of that. You can your author is just showing you how the hypothalamus is how it controls the pituitary. Basically, the hypothalamus releases what are called releasing factors that will dictate either the increase or decrease production of various hormones. Okay, like here you can see as an example, the posterior pituitary oxytocin and vasopressin are synthesized in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. Oxytocin and vasopressin are carried by axonal transport down the stalk, which is shown here. Oxytocin and vasopressin are released into the general circulation, and so there's this really elegant connection. And so as oxytocin and vasopressin, maybe as those levels tend to increase, then you get this feedback, which essentially directs the hypothalamus to make less of it. Now that's assuming that it's working, right? All right, so kind of going back here, and that is the releasing hormones, hypothalamic releasing. And you can see some of that. And like I said, regulation. Basically, the whole point of all this is just to give you a better idea of the feedback system. All right, so we've got there's neural regulation essentially. There's neural regulation. There's elevations in the hormones. Increases or decreases that can serve to signal the halting or the initiation of the production of the substance, and so forth. Once again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's other things I want to go to. But be aware of course, the gonadotropin releasing hormones. These are more involved with sexual behavior and development and so forth. So the anterior pituitary has the gonadotropins, and so the gonads are essentially going to be producing the progestins, the androgens, and estrogens, and these are all hormones. Remember, hormones go into cells and can initiate fairly long-term changes. It could be changes in behavioral responses. It could be changes in the physical structure of the body, which we'll get to in a little bit here. And here you can see regulation of the gonadal hormones. All right. So we have the brain essentially can control the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary. Pituitary then controls the gonads. Gonads are releasing the hormones into the tissues. And then we can see there's that feedback loop essentially. One of the things I like to point out is we often talk, when people become teenagers, we talk about, the hormones are surging. It's causing a change in their behavior and their mood swings and this, that, and the other. So we often think about hormones affecting our behavior, but don't forget that our behavior, the things that we're engaged in, can affect the hormones. All right. So behavior is influenced by gonadal hormones acting on the brain. But don't forget that our very behaviors, can actually maybe influence how much, let's say, testosterone is being made or how much estrogen is being made. So it all kind of works together. So it's kind of interesting there. Okay. All right, so let's see. Moving on to some anatomy here. Sexual differentiation. All right, so one of the things that is interesting for a lot of students that haven't been exposed to this before is, and you'll see this in the notes here, for humans, the default condition is female, and it takes essentially certain hormones, you know, uh, certain chemicals, based on, usually based on the genetic makeup there, meaning a Y chromosome, as an example for the male, to essentially defeminize the brain. All right, and that's what they go into here. So it's kind of interesting. We all kind of start off as females, and that's sort of the default condition. So if nothing else, essentially, if certain things did just not happen at all, everyone would be a female. But that's not obviously what happens. And that's this SRY gene, which is coded for. This is located on the Y chromosome. Without this SRY, males would essentially, genetic males would become a female. All right, but anyhow, the differentiation begins around at 6 weeks in the gestation. Let me see here. I'm not getting. Let me go back to outline view. Sorry about this. Hello, hello, hello. Okay. And what we have, and there's pictures of this, we have two different systems. So be aware of this. We got the Wolffian system and the Mullerian system. So the Wolffian system is essentially it forms the basis for the male reproductive system. The Mullerian is the female. All right. And I mentioned this. Default is to being a female. All right. So testes, by the 3rd month of gestation, they release androgens, which things like testosterone. They also release this Mullerian inhibiting substance. All right. So here we see the defeminization process, because the Mullerian system would form the basis for the female. Without this, you would have, even if you were a genetic male, so to speak, without it, males would become females. Or I should say not become, they would just stay female. Okay, so here you can see that, just look through here, we talk about the so-called bipotential precursor genitalia. Essentially, we can become both, all right? And it might be best, you can see the anatomy here. Let me just get back. For some reason, it's not letting me go to another page. Sorry, here we go. They're showing you some of the primordial genitalia and how it can become the female versus the male system. Here you can see if no SRY protein is present, the cortex and the primordial gonads develops into the ovaries under the influence of the SRY. Now the SRY is coded for on the Y chromosome. That's why you have to have the Y for the male. The medulla of the primordial gland develops into the testes. Once again, without that SRY, even an XY would become a female. All right, and here you can see this picture more or less says what you needed to say. Let me get back to the normal view. It might be easier to see that. Here you can see at 6 weeks, all human fetuses have antecedents of both the male and female systems. Once again, it can be both. So this is the primordial, or I should say the bipotential systems, right? You can have both. Later, and you can see here, under the influence of the testicular testosterone, the Wolffian system will develop, and you can see it develops into, there's the scrotum, the testes, the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles. In the absence of testosterone, the Mullerian system will develop. You can see there's the uterus, the ovaries, and the vagina. All right, so sort of interesting there. Get that back up. Oops. And here you can see the organs. Once again, you could just sort of go through this. You can see the development into the male or the female system, and there's the corresponding anatomy. All right, and you can look through all of that. The development of the male and female external reproductive organs from the same bipotential. It means it can go both ways. Bipotential. All right. So there is the 6 weeks after conception. Basically, it can go either way. It can become the male and become the female. You can see partial development to fully developed. All right. All right. Secondary sex characteristics are important. Obviously, now hormones during puberty cause what are called organizational changes, meaning that they're going to cause long-lasting physical changes in the body. All right. Um, and they also cause what are called activational changes, and these can occur throughout life, where the hormones like your testosterone and your estrogen can actually create behavioral changes, maybe temporary, right? It could increase, like, hormones, talk about the sex hormones. They can increase the desire for sexual activity, or, and so forth. And if there's maybe less testosterone or estrogen, there would be a decline in sexual desire. That would be more of an activational effect. But here you can see just kind of, you probably are aware of a lot of these. It makes sense here. Puberty, you have a growth spurt, development of the secondary sex characteristics. You can see for that, for the females, it's breast development. For males, it's the pitch change, menstruation in females. I believe it's called menarche, the first menstruation period. The role of, and so you can see that we have all of these hormones are going to essentially be involved with the physical change to the body. And there you can see these are just some of these are the list of the secondary sexual characteristics. All right. Um, which is important. Now, what about, I'm going to go through some of these, not necessarily all of this stuff here. I'm going to get to the outline view again. If it works, come on, if it works. I want to go to some of the differences in the brain. One of the things here is, I guess one of the questions, and there used to be a lot of research in this with people, the so-called sex differences between males and females in the brain. Are there differences? Do we find consistent differences between, let's say, the female brain and certain parts of the female brain, and then do we find that we have differences in the male? And there's research to indicate there might be something. So here you can see one hypothesis, the aromatization hypothesis, that in fact the brain gets masculinized during development due to the presence of estradiol. So here, testosterone is converted to estradiol, which is sort of interesting. So it used to be thought that testosterone essentially masculinized the brain directly. It does so, probably, but the evidence indicates it does so after it's converted into estradiol, which is actually an estrogen, which is sort of interesting. So estradiol masculinizes the brain, and so that's a hypothesis. All right, that's possible. That's a possible difference. So we might have so that, there. So I guess just when you read the chapter, just kind of take note of the possibility that the male brain is essentially masculinized. I guess it depends on how you look at it. You could look at it that the male brain is masculinized or it's defeminized, I suppose. That's two different ways of looking at it. So here, let me just try to get to some of these. I want to stick more to humans if I can. Yeah. Development of the sex differences in behavior. This is sort of interesting. When you look at the literature on the, female behavior, male and female, human male and female sexual behavior versus, let's say, different types of animals like rats or something. Maleness and femaleness is not as discrete, it's not as stereotyped as what you might find in the animal kingdom. So if you look at rats, your typical lab rat, the male and the female behaviors are very rigid, they're very stereotyped. Males and females, female rats, for example, will only engage in, the term is copulation, not, with a male only during those times of the month where she can get impregnated. I mean, I've read reports that, if male rats attempt to mount a female that's not, it's what's called estrus in the female rat. If they attempt to do that, the female rat might actually attack them. All right. Humans are not like that. Human beings can have, can engage in sexual behavior throughout the entire month, right? Then that's, and there has been some speculation that that's an evolved tendency. It could be a strategy, and whatever. That's all speculation. But regardless of exactly why, that's what we can do. So. Also, there are some sexually dimorphic behaviors, but there's a lot of overlap. All right, so we might think of, that maybe there's a certain characteristic way that men should act or that females should act in these situations, but it's not as discrete, all right, as we find in the typical animal kingdom. But there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of variability, and that's what your author is mentioning there. So it's kind of interesting. I'd also like to mention that human beings are not as quite as much influenced by hormones as, let's say, the rat. Um, one of the things about testosterone versus estrogen, and I can't remember if it's in your chapter or not, but testosterone does have what I mentioned this before. It has these activational effects on human behavior. So elevated testosterone is generally associated in both males and females with an increased desire to have some kind of sexual behavior. And it's not just males. We often think of, oh, males, they got all this testosterone. And, because if you look at the literature, generally speaking, males are more willing to have sex throughout the entire month. Women are a bit more choosy, right? Once again, it's just looking at aggregate data. Women are a bit more choosy. But interestingly enough, and I don't, this is in one of the other texts that I have, females, there is some evidence that while females are in the so-called para-ovulatory period, meaning around the time that they would ovulate, that their sexual desire tends to increase, and that's due to elevated levels of testosterone. A little bit, subtle differences. It might also be due to elevated levels of estrogen. I can't remember if it's estrogen's involved with that or not, but the point is that there might be it's subtle. It's very subtle. It's sort of a nudge. All right. So there's evidence that indicates that, which makes sense. That would tend to if we're looking at sexual behavior in terms of reproduction, propagation of the humans and the species, then it makes sense for a human female to have an increased desire around that time because that increases the chance of getting pregnant. Okay. Let's see here. I'm kind of moving along here. One thing to note in the text, exceptional cases of human sexual development. This is what you're seeing here in the text are cases of what are called intersex development. That's a term. I'm not sure how often that term is still used, but that's the term I was, when I went through this material initially all the years ago, kind of was taught. This is not to be confused with the transgender movement or transgender issues. These are cases of folks these are very unusual in the population, and these are cases of folks that have a genetic and or hormonal anatomical anomaly, which causes a certain amount of ambiguity in their gender. All right, and whereas the transgender, a person who can be a transgender that can decide to go from one gender to another based more on a personal decision or a personal a discomfort and things like that, but there's not necessarily a clear biological basis for it. All right, so that's the difference. This is not the same thing. Here you can see androgen insensitivity syndrome. All right, so this is a case where you could have an XY. Okay, so it's a genetic male, but the outward appearance is more of a female, because what happens is that you might have the XY, and so elevated androgen is you're gonna have that androgen go up, but you have to have cells in the body that are sensitive to that androgen, and if they're not sensitive, then essentially the defeminization process is not complete. The masculinization process does not happen as it normally would. So you get sparse pubic or axillary hair, but you have this intersex where there's this gender ambiguity. There's a shallow vagina. You have internal testes and reproductive ducts. All right, so you have a certain amount of it's not in this case the gender is ambiguous. You're not really it's not like a strict male or a strict female. And folks that have these kind of issues, you can see that they can become quite distressed, but they're called intersex. We also have the androgenital syndrome. It's also called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and so forth. Tends to be more of a problem when you have a genetic female that has elevated levels of androgens in the adrenal glands. Your androgens, like your testosterone, are produced, let's say in the male by the testes, but they're also produced by the adrenal glands that are located on the kidneys or whatever. And that's what hyperplasia means, that there's just there's an abnormally high levels. All right, that's the hyperactivity. Males don't tend to be affected by this particular problem, but females, you get an enlarged clitoris, partially fused labia, and it causes. So we get this elevated, we get this alteration of the anatomy. and so forth. And here you can see some other ones. There, the ablatio penis. This is the penis removed. Um, this was, there's a whole line of literature you can explore here. Obviously, it's kind of late in the course at this point, but this, there's a whole, gosh, a whole series of God, you look back in the 1970s and back, there was sometimes in cases, if castration was, not done properly, then a doctor would just remove the penis and tell the parents to just raise boys as a girl. Almost, and it's just some tragedies would emerge from this. And you can see this was a case back in 1975. Boy was treated with estrogen after this. Boy was unhappy. He wanted the sex change. He was heterosexual, and there's all kinds of problems here. And this was all due to essentially malpractice. Um, so this is extremely rare, but my gosh, it's really terrible what happens here. Um, okay, so that's some of that. Moving along, but yes, I talked about this already a little bit, kind of going back to the effects that hormones can have on behaviors. So male sexual behavior and testosterone. Androgens do activate male sexual behavior. You get with this, orchidectomy. This is essentially castration, right? You get essentially an erectile dysfunction from that. And the idea there is that you're reducing the testosterone, that castration there. Physical changes, reduction of body hair, softening of the skin, etc. And then in order to, so what you're seeing here is essentially with this is that there's the evidence that you can, with the changes in the hormones, you get a change in the physical appearance. You get a change in the physical appearance and also the motivation. All right, get a change there. So, all right. So what we see is reduced sexual motivation there. Now, interestingly enough, even if you have either one or both of the testicles removed, you still get testosterone from the adrenal glands. Right. This was actually a procedure that was done on some sex offenders, child molesters and such, in an attempt to curb their behavior. It's not entirely successful because the adrenals are still present. And maybe there's other reasons too for that. It's not just that. I think the theory is that it's all based on the testosterone, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And so forth. And you can see here sexual behavior. This is some animal research here you can look at in your text. Here you can see female sexual behavior and the gonadal hormones. Here you can certainly you can look at this is the so-called estrous cycle in rodents. We don't call that. We call it the menstrual cycle in humans. Here we see once again some of the effects of hormonal changes on females. Ovarectomy eliminates vaginal lubrication, cycle, and fertility. But interestingly enough, it doesn't have a particularly significant effect on sexual motivation. All right. So we see humans are a little different. Note with the female rat, an ovarectomy abolishes estrus, and so forth. And it might actually, it'll change sexual receptivity quite clearly. Now here your author's mentioning no clear-cut receptivity. I mentioned some studies earlier. I mentioned that some studies indicate that with a menstrual cycle in human females, there can be very subtle changes. All right, so the research that is out there, but like all research, it's not clear cut. There's no proof here, but certainly humans are not nearly as influenced by hormones as, let's say, the typical rat. Okay, now the last thing in here, let's see. I don't want to get into the steroid use there so much. Let's mention some of the brain structures involved with sexual activity. So you can see this nice laundry list. Let's just sort of go through some of these things. Of course, the cortex, active by sexually arousing stimuli. Okay, that's pretty vague. Amygdala could be important. Processes visual and olfactory signals. Men more aroused by visual stimuli than women. Okay, that makes sense. Things like that. The ventral striatum. The striatum is usually involved with this part of the reinforcement system. All right, so here we can see activated in anticipation of sexual activity. So that's part of the motivation. So once again, it's reinforcement. The hypothalamus is quite important. We have the so-called sexually dimorphic nucleus. It means it's different in males than females in terms of the size, larger in males than females. Does it affect sexual behavior? Not quite sure. You can see lesions diminish copulatory behavior. Bilateral lesions only slight effects on the male behavior. So there's, once again, they're looking at um, with animals, we might see some changes. Humans, it's, we're not quite sure. Um, the ventral medial nucleus, another part of the hypothalamus, might be important for female sexual behavior. We can see once again, there are a lot of these. When you see evidence like lesions and stuff like that, we're talking more about rats. You're not doing this with humans, okay? You're not lesioning that. Um, you can see here some of the work on sexual orientation and so forth. Sort of interesting. So there's some work done with animals. There's a lot of work actually where you can induce an, an, an attempt to induce certain behaviors, like here with animals, testosterone treatment of females induces same-sex preference. So there's evidence possibly that you can have these early hormonal effects can alter sexual orientation. So there might be that. Um, there's some interesting questions here. Is there a difference in the brains of homo and heterosexuals, right? So there's Simon LeVay back in the 90s did some work. He basically found that with human anatomy, hypothalamic anatomy, that there might very well be differences between homo and heterosexuals. Um, there were some problems with the research because at the time he used for the homosexuals, he had used males in particular that had died of HIV, AIDS at the time, and HIV can potentially have an impact on the nervous system. So there's some interesting stuff there. So there's and there's issues with it being replicated. So that's something to consider. Um, and that there's those issues there. Uh, those particular